Okay, so let me welcome to the second session of our conference, All Hands on Deck, 5 years of common challenges and shared solutions. So this first panel today is meant to provide us with a multi-stakeholder vision for the next 5 years. Our hopes and fears for this new European Commission, for this new European Parliament, for the presidencies, which I would like to discuss with representatives from science, a business-led multi-stakeholder initiative, young people, and the European movement. So what do we all believe? What can the EU provide us with in terms of answers for the big environmental questions in the next 5 years? What can be done in the next 2 to 5 years? What must be done? And who should do what? These are the guiding questions for this panel. So let me first introduce the panelists. We are very pleased to have with us Dirk Messner, an internationally known expert in sustainability studies. He's also the director of the Institute for Environment and Human Security at the UN University in Bonn. He's the co-chair of the German Advisory Council on Global Change. And in January, he will take office as the next president of the German Environment Agency, UBA. Thank you very much for being with us. Then we have with us Nick Molho, Executive Director of the Aldersgate Group in the UK. He has long-standing experience in climate and environmental policies. The Aldersgate Group is a UK-based multi-stakeholder alliance championing a competitive and environmentally sustainable economy. They advocate the business case for decarbonising the UK economy and beyond, and improving resource efficiency and investing in the natural environment. And the membership of the Aldersgate Group comprises not only leading NGOs and institutes and public sector bodies and politicians, but also some of the largest businesses in the UK, with a collective global turnover of £550 billion. Welcome very much. Then we have Rebecca Freitag. Rebecca is the German UN Youth Delegate on Sustainable Development. So she accompanies the German delegations to UN conferences to give young people a voice at these meetings. She's been traveling around the country to seek young people's input into these processes. So I assume she can share with us a bit like a temperature check of what young people think in Germany these days. And she tries to connect youth climate strikers internationally, and she has organized climate strikes, for instance, in Kenya and in Brazil. And she studies natural resource management here in Berlin. And then we have with us Linn Selle. She's the president of the European movement here in Germany, which is the country's largest network dealing with European affairs and politics, with 250 member organizations, truly multi-stakeholder across the board. And before being elected to this role last year, Linn was already in a leading role with the Young European Federalists in Germany, and she's also a consumer rights expert and a very known voice on European affairs in Germany. So welcome to all of you. Thank you very much for being with us today. I also need to excuse Kilik Puye, the director of Social Platform, who is unfortunately sick and cannot be with us today. But I think we have 4 very interesting panelists, and we will easily be able to fill the time before lunch. So let us start with some initial thoughts from our panelists. I wanted to start with science, so with Dirk Messner. Scientists have been warning us that we will not meet the 1.5 degree target. We might be going towards 2, 3, 4 degrees. So science has been very clear on what we have to do, what we need to do to avert climate and environmental collapse. Do you see that now policies are following suit? Or in which areas do the EU and the member states have to really speed up action in order to protect our life support systems?
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation and to the chance to interact with you. I heard and listened to some interesting remarks already in the first discussion. So the question was on time pressure, on policy coherence, on incrementalism versus leapfrogging. So how can we think about sustainability transformations in this context? And I would like to emphasize briefly 4 axes which I would have in mind. So if I would have the chance to interact with the Commission itself, I might make this kind of points. Now, the first issue is about the time pressure, and one large area where we need to make progress from a climate perspective, it's on mobility. Now, we are making some progress in the energy sector. We are not making at all progress until now in the mobility sector. So imagine a European Commission developing a European infrastructure plan to reduce internal flights in Europe by 80% but towards 2035 or so. For this kind of vision, we needed a huge infrastructure perspective and respective infrastructure investments also. So this would be a big thing. It would be leapfrogging. It would be an ambitious goal. And we need these kind of actions because internal flights in Europe cannot be solved by national governments only. So this would be a European brand. No? The second issue which I wanted to mention is related to the digital dimension. I'm the head of the chair of the German Advisory Council on Global Change. We just produced and published a report on digitalization and sustainability transformations in the digital age. And it is astonishingly, actually, looking back to 2015, when we got Paris, when we got the 2015 agenda, that we ignored from the sustainability community and also from sustainability research, this fundamental and deep changes in the field of innovation. And what we show in our report is that actually we could do much better thinking about green economy, so decarbonization, circular economy, resource efficiency, energy efficiency, observing and monitoring and protecting, therefore, ecosystems with these technologies than without those, but we are not doing it. So we are using these kind of digital devices until now to prolong or even trigger unsustainable growth. This is what we see. So we need urgently build bridges between these two big transformations, the sustainability transformation on the one hand side and the digital transformation on the other hand side. One element which also belongs to the digital dimension and could be very important for Europe, therefore, is that digitalization goes very far. Digitalization, artificial intelligence, machine learning, this will change the way we organize our economies, the way we think about democracy. It will change even the way we think about human development and humans, because with these technologies, we can start to enhance human beings. So if you bring together big data and genome research, we can start about enhancing humans. So we will get a completely different sustainability paradigm in this field in the age of digitalization. So this is a big issue. Europe should be on the forefront. The third element, very briefly, it has been mentioned during the first discussion round also, we will not get environmental issues right if we don't get social cohesion right. This is the point where environmental issues and climate change issues need to be related to the 2030 agenda. And Europe could do much more. We do not even have a plan for that. So we do not even have a European plan to implement the 2030 agenda. This is something which is urgent because we are in 2020 now, nearly. No? We have 10 years to deliver and implement, so let's move forward. And very important, what is linked to this kind of debate, is that we need to convince people that sustainability and environmental issues could be linked to attractive future perspectives. And the 2030 agenda could be something like that, an attractive future perspective. And my last point is then something which also had been mentioned in the first round, the global order. So multilateralism is at stake, international cooperation is decreasing, we do have authoritarian dynamics in many parts around the world. Europe needs to bundle forces to become a sustainable superpower. This could be related to the digital thing. So if we would be able to develop a model of sustainability in the digital age, this could really make a difference. We do have two other models. No? We have the Chinese model where digitalization is being used to optimize authoritarian rules. Terrible. No? And we have another model where digitalization is driven mainly by private companies and markets only. I'm not sure that this can be linked to global public goods and commons perspectives and sustainability. So how could a European model look like? No? My last sentence is that, we need from a European perspective and from a sustainability perspective an idea how to shape the global order and global economics. Now, China has its Silk Road concept. We might not like it, but they have an idea how the future of the global economy might look like. We do not have such an idea. And we cannot do this as national economies. We need to do this together at the European level. So bringing together democracy, digitalization from a commons and sustainability perspective with a global view, this could be something which might make Europe much stronger and more attractive.
Thank you very much. Let's move, yes, please. let's move to a business perspective. So, Nick, many businesses, also in particular, I would say transnational corporations, are all in for sustainability, at least when it's on paper. Everybody uses the SDGs in their reports, and so forth. Now, your group, the Aldersgate group, represents a quite large diversity of also of corporations in terms of size, in terms of product, in terms of sectors. And I understand you're looking for that diversity to bring in the different sectors, and some of them are really world leaders in their respective sectors. So, can you tell us a bit more about the ambitions of these companies within your group, and maybe give us some more concrete examples of how, in particular, multinationals have really already made an impact or a tangible reduction of their environmental footprint? Some concrete examples.
Okay, well, hello everyone. We've been working with progressive businesses for quite a long time, but it's fair to say that up until recently, they really were in a minority. But my key message today is that we've really seen quite a change, if you like, over the last 18 months in business attitudes towards climate change and environmental degradation. It's been quite a significant shift. And this really came out, we've really noticed it in our recent work on net zero emissions. So over the last 18 months, we've been working very closely with a very broad range of businesses and sectors to try and get the UK government to adopt a net zero target, which they did a few months ago, but also to try and understand from businesses, including and especially hard to treat sectors, what do they need in order to accelerate innovations, in order to achieve net zero emissions, and in order to maintain viable business models during the net zero transition, because that's quite a difficult issue for many businesses. And two things really came out. The first one is that the number and diversity of businesses and business sectors that have taken on net zero targets or environmental targets has really grown over the last 18 months. So just to give you 3 examples, in the retail sector, you have big retailers like Tesco who are very active in countries such as Slovakia, Poland, Ireland, the UK. They were the first FTSE 100 company in the UK stock exchange to take on a science-based targets, aligning themselves with the 1.5 degree target and backing it up with plans on renewable energy and energy efficiency investments. In the manufacturing sector, I think a lot of you will be familiar with the commitments from Siemens, who've taken on a global target to bring their carbon emissions down in line with net zero by 2030. But critically, Pascal Confin referenced the importance of finance earlier on, and you've got companies such as Legal & General, who are the largest money manager in the UK, and they've now taken on quite a proactive name and shame policy, whereby they ask the companies they invest in to align with the goals of the Paris Agreement, and if a year later no action has been taken, they will name and shame and potentially disinvest from some of those companies. And you saw them doing that with ExxonMobil not long ago, which was something that was long overdue. So you're seeing that diversity, and I think it became quite visual in a country like the UK back in June, where we had around 130 businesses who signed a public letter to the then Prime Minister Theresa May asking for the UK to legislate for a net zero target. And what was interesting is, although the letter had a strong environmental dimension to it, there was a big focus on climate science, there was a huge focus on the business case. So saying actually, by having very clear targets, very clear delivery policies, you reduce the cost of investments, you allow technologies to be deployed much faster and at scale, but you also actually create supply chain growth opportunities and export opportunities for UK and European businesses. And the race is on to be active on this agenda. So that was positive. But for me, the most important thing and the most interesting thing is that a lot of the shift can actually be seen from businesses or sectors that up until just a few years ago really had quite a negative stance on climate policy, and really saw climate policy as a threat to their competitiveness. One of the things we did was we set up a couple of roundtables with a lot of companies and trade groups from hard-to-treat sectors. So we spoke to agriculture, we spoke to steel, cement, chemicals, aviation, not sectors that you would traditionally associate with, beacons of climate action. And I was really bracing myself for quite difficult roundtables, because what we wanted to talk to them about is, okay, we need to go for net zero, so how, what can you do to help contribute to that? And what really struck me was just the change in tone coming from a lot of those trade associations and companies. And I think that was partially driven by the fact that when you talk to some of the cement and steel manufacturers, they've been struggling with competitiveness for a number of years now, and actually are starting to realize that maybe the net zero and environmental agenda could be something that differentiates them from some of their global competitors. Maybe it is, after all, in the words of one particular cement company, maybe this is an opportunity to bring the jobs back. This is something that was unthinkable just 5 years ago. Even in a private discussion, I would never have heard anything like that. So you're starting to see that manifest itself in slightly more concrete commitments. So you look at the agricultural sector in the UK, the National Farmers Union has committed to bring the UK agricultural sector to have net zero climate impact by 2040. You look at in countries like Sweden, you've got some really interesting trials to produce zero carbon steel. There's a hybrid trial in particular that's trying to create steel on the basis of hydrogen made from renewable sources. In the UK, we have a company called Liberty Steel that's spending around 700 million euros over 3 years to manufacture zero carbon steel from by recycling steel and using renewable energy to melt the steel and reconfigure it into high quality recycled steel. And we're seeing the Mexican cement company Cemex partnering in the UK with the French waste company Suez to actually help create a new kind of fuel for cement, which is made of industrial and household waste, and turning it into a fuel to operate cement kilns. So there are things happening. It's still early days. It's still not the scale that we need, but things are moving in the right direction. And what is interesting is that it's not just about climate change. It's also about broader environmental commitments. So if I look at the area where we got most corporate involvement over the last 5 years in our work in Brussels, it's been the circular economy and the circular economy package. Huge desire to completely change a lot of the regulatory framework around a circular economy to promote resource-efficient product standards, to change the EU's procurement policy so it starts rewarding more resource-efficient businesses. But again, it's early days. We need to see more progress. So that's not to say that all businesses are doing great things. There are a huge amount of laggards, and there are particular sectors where things are not moving fast enough. And I think the energy sector, there's a big distinction to be made between the power company side of the sector, where you're starting to see more progressive players like Ørsted, which used to be called Dong Energy, compared to the oil and gas sector, where you still have lots of oil majors who are nowhere near having any kind of sort of climate strategy, let alone a net zero aligned strategy. So I guess two key points to finish on. The first one is that although there is a degree of business momentum on this agenda, we are going to need more than that. I think EU policy has a huge role to play, especially for sectors where decarbonization is difficult. And I think two key areas for policy will be around innovation, so accelerating innovation for critical technologies to decarbonize difficult sectors. So for example, in the case of heavy industry, you're looking at the role of hydrogen, you're looking at the potential of CCS, you're looking at the potential for fuel switching and electrification. We need to trial some of those new technologies at scale. But there's also a big social role for policy, and Pascal Canfin sort of alluded to that earlier on. Ultimately, we need to make sure that a transition happens in a way whereby the European workforce, both the existing workforce and the future workforce, is being given support in terms of skills development. Because a lot of the studies that we've done around how, and we've seen around how the economy will change when you move towards a net zero world, mean that existing industries will evolve quite a bit. The nature and location of some of the existing jobs will change, and new supply chains are going to be created. So we need a much more coordinated skills policy to make sure that we actually have a workforce that can benefit from some of the economic opportunities that the net zero transition has to offer. I think a final word on the European Green Deal. I think the climate and environmental agenda creates two issues for Europe. The first one is a challenge. I think it's the next 5 years are going to be a critical time for the EU to prove its worth, especially on the climate and environmental agenda. But I think it also gives it an opportunity. If we play it right, the European Green Deal could really help the EU face down some of its fiercest critics. And I think really what's at stake here is making sure that the Green New Deal can genuinely be ambitious from a climate and environmental standpoint? So is it genuinely going to deliver the rapid emission reductions and biodiversity restoration actions that we need in the 2020s? Is it going to help direct investment towards parts of Europe that are in need of economic regeneration? Because that's going to be really important. We've got to remember the Eastern European dimension of the debate here as well. And finally, will the Green New Deal come with a social and skills-based policy dimension that will ensure that all parts of European citizens and the European workforce are actually able to benefit from some of the economic growth opportunities or job opportunities that a transition to a net zero economy offers? And I think the EU is going to have to be particularly active on all three. But if it takes on the challenge, I think it can really help restore the cross-society and cross-economy consensus behind the European project. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Nick. I'm sure we'll come back to quite a few of these points. So yes, please. Let's come to Rebecca Freitag. We all know, we've all seen the young people taking to the streets over the last year, well, in the millions around the globe, and both the youth climate movement and other movements like Extinction Rebellion have really resulted in new traction on climate and environmental policies, and they have contributed to the green wave that we have seen during the European elections in May earlier this year. So being part of these movements, have you been able to see that these demands have been translated into real policies, in ambitious policies? What have been the successes that you've seen with your movement? And what are your demands, and what are you hoping for these next 5 years?
Hello, good morning. Yeah, looking at the news, it's really hopeful to look at the news when it comes to the EU, saying this as a German, because right now in Germany there's not so much progressive way forward. But when it comes to the EU, we do see that green wave when it comes to the election turnouts, when it comes to the new Green Deal, when it comes to the European Investment Bank announcing they will not invest into fossil fuels anymore, or having a first workshop only for youth coming from the DG for Environment, actually. But then, are our demands fulfilled? Well, no, they are not. Actually, and maybe another footnote here is that, a lot of people tend to say thanks to the young people, but to be honest, this could never have happened if we didn't have enough work coming from NGOs like you are doing, the work that you are doing. So I think this is worth mentioning. So we came up with demands at the conference in Lausanne, and actually they're very broad, but in the end it's about the demand to become net zero by the early 2030s, which is, of course, we cannot see that yet in the policies. We also have some demands on, protecting the ecosystem and biodiversity, and having circular economies and so on and so forth. But also one important demand in my eyes is the access to truthful information, and also the involvement, participation of not only young people but also scientists, workers, companies, and so on. And I think this is what we need to see in the future. So these are the demands, and then at the same time, again, I read the news, and they say there was just this report that announced that the G20 countries actually increased their emission and not decreased, and a lot of them are European countries. I also read the headline about the big fossil fuel companies spent 250 million on EU lobbying in the past 10 years. So I think this leads to three main demands that we need to concentrate on for the next 5 years. Well, the first is enhance the NDCs. The second one would be the role of finance. Right now, the, what is it called? Multi-annual financial framework is being discussed. And I think we need to concentrate on that and to make sure that the SDGs are being visible there as well. And also using finance in general as a leverage, also within countries where fossil fuels are being quite dominating, actually. And the third one is actually participation. How can we make sure, and also maybe with the help of digitization, how can we make sure that our voices are getting more heard, and especially young people are sitting at the negotiation table, because it's like we are the ones who have to live with the consequences the most in the end. And one more thought about why the EU is so important. I just come back I was traveling in Brazil and meeting a lot of Fridays for Future leaders, and they have completely different problems. Like, the questions they have is rather, well, how can we protest if young people are still being killed on the streets? And, does striking even make sense if we don't go to school? Like, these kind of questions. And it reminded me again that actually, striking and protesting and the freedom of speech is a privilege that we have here right now in the EU, and that with that privilege comes a lot of responsibility as well. So I just try to give that back to you also, to say that we need to take up that responsibility that we have in the world for other people as well, and make the EU stronger again, make the EU becoming a leader again globally when it comes to environmental protection. And also geopolitically, who else will lead the way into a green future? And I think there's also one event that we should focus on, which is the EU China Summit, which is right before the Glasgow conference. So that would be my news. I can also give a quick overview about the national situation of Fridays for Future. So how does Fridays for Future actually work? Well, I think in many countries it's the same, that we have it's very low in hierarchy. It's all run by students, actually. But in Germany, for example, we have huge support also. Well, we have support in the background coming from huge NGOs like Greenpeace, like Friends of the Earth, BUND, and so on. But we also got a lot of support from the scientists. Scientists for Future is actually a big organization that helped us setting up the demands, the scientific-based demands that we have in Germany, and that also gave us a lot of backing and acceptance among the public, actually. And at the last Global Strike Day, we managed to mobilize 1.4 million people to get on the streets, but also with the help of a lot of, other actors such as unions and companies and so on. So again, this is something that shows us that we need to connect with others. And what I did was actually I started a global climate action campaign, and therefore I created a youth coalition within Germany consisting of many different youth organizations. And together we were writing letters to the ministries who were negotiating the climate plan. And we have never expected so many positive turnouts. So we got invited by a lot of ministries at a very high level. We also met the head of the Chancellery to talk and discuss the climate plan. And this shows clearly that right now we have a huge will of institutions to talk to young people and to include them also at the EU level, actually. And this is something that we should all together use, because we are young people, and we do not have full-time staff working for us and giving us, information on science and data. But I think also for the EU in general, this is something where you could support young activists, because right now there is this momentum, and we should make the best out of it.
Thank you. Well, we've been speaking about some of the privileges that we enjoy in Europe, such as freedom of speech, and which are part of our fundamental European values. And it brings me to our fourth panelist, Linn Selle from the European movement. But I have an environmental question for you. Environmental, as we've mentioned before, environmental policies have often ranked top in surveys amongst European citizens about what they like in European policies, and people want the EU to do more for the environment. And And what do you, as part of the European movement in Germany and the movement across the EU, think about the European Green Deal? What can it deliver in the next 5 years? And do you think it can be one element that can help us to repair a somewhat lost European identity?
Yeah, first of all, also thank you for the invitation. I think thinking about climate policy, it is quite clear that we can only counter this problem on a European scale, probably even on a global scale. But as we have the European Union, let's stay there for a moment. I think on the global issues, Rebecca is more suited to talk about that. So even if now in Germany, at least, we have this climate plan, it is evident that we need European legislation and European plans for this. So it is kind of logical that now environmental and climate policies has become one of the priorities of the new European Commission and the President-elect Ursula von der Leyen. So what we see is that these issues rank among the top 6 of her program, of her work program for the next 5 years, and even probably as being one of the most visible tools or one of the most visible ideas that the Commission will work on in the next years, because the Commission first Executive Vice President, I'm still struggling with the names, Franz Timmermans, he is in charge of the Green New Deal. So he is also about to deliver within the first 100 days of the new Commission's start into office, this Green New Deal. So there is this urgency, an urgency which I also would support Rebecca in, is because of the work of organizations over many years raising this issue, but also the work of young activists, experts, to bring this issue on a whole new level. Because what we see, this urgency, is mainly or is also due to this huge struggle on the streets and the debates we've seen in the last year, that millions of people went to the streets. So this is within the European Commission a priority. It will also be a priority for the Council presidencies of Croatia and Germany. So also for us as European Movement Germany, as Germany will have the Council presidency from next June, we will closely follow this. The thing is, when we see what do we think about the Green New Deal, actually until now we don't know a lot about it. We know what should be in it, for example, a just transition a deal in order to alleviate social problems that might be connected also to this transition. It should be a stronger a Sustainable Europe investment plan, but actually until there is no proposal, we can't really talk about it in detail. And this is at the moment a bit of a problem, because we have very high expectations from all sorts of actors, what we already heard here already. But until now, we don't really know the details and how far there will be. For example, Commission President von der Leyen said that she wants to be the first, Europe to be the first emission zero continent, which is great, but the question is, how do we implement that? What is the specific road we take in order to go there? And for us as European Movement Germany, most of these demands of the new Commission are pretty much in line with our political program, which is also thanks to the active involvement of the DNR, who is our member and who shape our policy on that a lot. And I think I would pretty much applaud what you said on this element of social cohesion when it comes to this transition, because if we look at all EU member states, I think there is a lot of challenges. There is, of course, a lot of positive transition being able to being implemented, but we also have to take care of, this just transition element. And to give you maybe an idea from our perspective why we are not skeptical, because it is very important to have the European Green New Deal as a broad idea and as having a strategy for the next 5 years and hopefully beyond. But the devil's always in the detail, and it is a question of implementation. When we look at what has been going on in the past years, we see that the EU still has not launched a European implementation of the Agenda 2030 that has already been mentioned. Also the Sustainable Development Goals, where it is really urgent that we fulfill these goals until 2030, they haven't been actually catered enough for within the European budget, within the common agricultural policy. So already plans we have since many years still lack implementation. And what we also see, and where it is important to follow what already Rebecca said, is the current negotiation to the multi-annual financial framework, because it has been started to negotiate 2 years ago, where of course the European Green New Deal wasn't a policy program yet. So actually the ideas that Commission President-designate von der Leyen has, her programs that she proposed, they aren't financed yet. They aren't part of the multi-annual financial framework debate. So I think this is also something for the community here to check that these programs, the Just Transition Fund, and also the European Green New Deal in general, to have them being implemented or included into the MFF, because if there are no finances behind it, there will be no implementation. And so, at the end of the day, implementation is key, and also concrete policy proposals are key. And this is something that we have to look at very closely in the next 100 days. Also taking in mind that, of course, 100 days is not a lot of time. So I think Franz Timmermans has quite a hard job in the upcoming 3 months. And maybe this question you ask on can the European Green New Deal cater for a lost European identity? And I think here, on the one hand, yes. I think a Green New Deal or a decisive action towards climate transition could show that politics are able to deliver, because this is something that at the moment is a fundamental problem in many European societies. This question is, we have so many global problems, not only climate, but also social injustice, globalization. But politics sometimes creates the image of not being able to act. And I think the European Green New Deal can be a very vivid image and a policy where we can show that politics are able to deliver. But on the other hand, I think we also have to say that this question of European identity, and I think most of you in the room are more knowledgeable of climate policies than I am, but if I understood correctly the analysis of the European Parliament on the European elections, climate change was less of an urgent topic in many Middle and Eastern European states as in Western Europe. And so I think we also have to be careful of not overemphasizing this issue on being the thing for Europe, because we have member states that face also many more fundamental problems, as you cited from Brazil, but we also have still very high unemployment rates in many states, deeply social problems, no social net or a very basic social net in some EU member states. So I think in this question of having this policy being delivered might be very strong or resonate very strongly in countries like Germany, Scandinavia. But I think we should not forget that, especially in the east of Europe, it might not be such of a big problem. But I'm also happy of those of you here who have more knowledge on that to discuss it. But that's how I understood the post-election surveys.
Thank you. Well, it's definitely one question that we would have discussed with social platform if Kelly would have been able to be here. But I guess we'll pick up on the question of how to kind of make sure that the European Green Deal can deliver on both the environmental, social, and economic dimension of sustainable development. So I'll have short follow-up questions for each of the panelists, but with short answers. But I want you to get ready with your questions. So we already have on Slido, you can start asking questions, and we can also see if there's some trending questions or issues that are really of concern to many of you. But then, of course, you will be invited to also speak individually after a short round of follow-up questions. And actually, Rebecca will have to leave us a little bit earlier because she will be running to Bremen, where she will hopefully convince the Bremen politicians to step up climate ambition, and we don't want to stop her from doing that. So bear with us, and maybe if you have questions for Rebecca, ask her first so we can let her leave at around noon. No, not yet, in a minute. So I have a short follow-up question for each of you, but let's be short so we don't have to let the audience wait too long. Dirk Messner, you said a couple of things that I think we should be discussing. But given that, the German presidency we already know that there will be a focus on digitalization, and you mentioned the report that you're working on, and maybe also because some of us are not too familiar with the subject yet, I would just like to ask you to give us a brief example, because you said that we shouldn't leave digitalization to business, the digital business. We shouldn't leave it to the Chinese model. But what is the model that we should be striving for? And can you give us just one or two concrete examples of how we can use digitalization rightly?
Very briefly, I mean, digitalization is accelerating now. The way we start using artificial intelligence and machine learning across the board in industries and in society will shape our societies very fundamentally. But, of course, digitalization started already 20, 25 years ago with the internet and then social media, now the Internet of Things, etc., etc. And what we see is that although our assessment demonstrates that we can solve green economy issues better with these technologies than without those, we don't see until now, after 20 years of digitalization, that emissions are not going down and resources are not decoupled from wealth creation. So this is a fact. This implies that we still have not built the bridges between digitalization on the one hand side and sustainability transformations on the other hand side. So maybe three examples what we needed to think about or what we needed to implement rapidly. The first thing is something where I'm responsible actually, because what we demonstrate in this report which we published in April already, what we demonstrate is that the research communities, so those doing research on the Earth system, sustainability issues, etc., on the one hand side, and then the digital people, artificial intelligence, machine learning, we have not been working together. So there is no overlap. So we do not understand exactly and good enough in the sustainability crowd how we could use these dynamics to make sustainability better. And on the other hand side, the digital people don't understand the Earth system challenges. So urgently, this is a question of science policy. We need to bring these communities together. This is number one. Number two is also very simple, but a huge effort, which also needed to be organized now at the European level. When we sat together with the German Advisory Council and representatives from all ministries of the German government, one of the colleagues from one of the ministries raised her hand asking into the crowd, could we do around the table asking the ministries how many people we have in our administration having real knowledge on artificial intelligence, machine learning, and then how we could use this for sustainability purposes. And the numbers have been incredibly small. So we do not have the knowledge in our public administrations and our public institutions to shape digitalization towards sustainability. We cannot govern what we do not understand. This is about state modernization from this perspective. And the last point seems to be very boring, but it is very important. I mean, how to shape digital innovations towards sustainability. We are talking about green tech systems for 3-4 decades now. So taxing resources and emissions instead of taxing labor. No? As long as we are taxing labor high and resources and emissions low, technologies will be used to substitute labor. And this is what we are observing. We need a tax reform to shift innovations towards sustainability. So these are some basic reflections. But what I also wanted to mention is that, and we presented a charter on sustainability in the digital age in New York some weeks ago. It's a climate summit. Rebecca, you might have been there also, no? And what we described there is that the 2030 agenda needs to be developed further because the digital age will be differently. This has to do with artificial intelligence. This has to do with machine learning. We have been producing machines outperforming our muscles. This has been the first industrial revolution. No? Now we are producing machines which are outperforming our brains. This will have implications at many sectors in almost any corner of our societies and our economies. And we need to start thinking about this rapidly. This will be a new sustainability era. This will be a new sustainability paradigm. And this is what we are emphasizing in this publication about sustainability transformations in the digital age.
Thank you. Let me move to Rebecca, also looking at the time and making sure we have enough time with you. Well, most of you have already spoken about, well, the question of the environmental and the social dimension and how to bring the different movements but also the different interests of people together. But let's, maybe you want to comment on this and also from your experience working with young people across the EU and beyond the EU's borders. I mean, what do you perceive as differences and what do young people care about across the EU and what are the differences that you perceive there? But also taking one step back, I mean, you've started talking about new forms of engagement, new forms of participation. I mean, what are your thoughts there? And maybe you can also elaborate a little bit more about how we as the, let's say, established environmental movement, the environmental NGOs, how can we collaborate better with the youth climate movement? Or what are your expectations? What would you need? What do you not need from us? And how can we make sure we work together, I mean, within the environmental movement, but also across the different movements in a kind of a more cross-sectoral coalition of civil society?
Wow, so many important questions. And I think I will start with some basic reflections that I had during the past years where I was also working a lot on youth participation, also at the UN level. Why is it so difficult for youth to, raise their voice? Like, why aren't we included? While there are so many good arguments we should. Well, I think we have some disadvantages, and the disadvantages are, for example, we are so young that nobody is really trusting us because we couldn't prove yet that we are trustable. Secondly, we have no money, and thirdly, we also have, we have like, there are some exceptions, but we don't really have an institution, or we don't have full-time employees working for us, feeding us with information. So I almost also see that as a democratic deficit, because mostly we can only vote at the age of 18. So, okay, but at the same time, being a youth delegate, I feel like my role is being a watchdog on what the politicians are doing. And I think this is definitely something that we do not only need at the UN level, but also at the EU level. Young people who are in the negotiations, who know what this is about, and who are the watchdogs on decision makers. And having said this, maybe this is something where you as an NGO know better understand how you can support us. Basically, this could be about like feeding us with information when we have those kind of political meetings, and giving us science, background information, and so on. But before I came here, I actually asked some friends of those climate strikers around Europe. I asked them, what is it that you want from NGOs? And the thing that they said most was actually information flow. We have no idea what's going on at the EU level. It's so far away. We are already, so busy with organizing the strikes and so on. So it's really hard for them to keep track on what's going on at the EU level. So having that information flow from the EU institution and the level to the local activists, to the youth at the local level is super crucial. Tell them what they need to pressure on, what they need to focus on. Is there a country that is blocking something? Then go to the local strikers and tell them, pressure your local national government on this. Also, what you could do is making youth more visible in your own organization. Knowledge sharing, I was saying already. Connect to local groups also means like help them with mobilization, with material. So there are definitely different needs in between the countries. There was a poll recently that asked young people from 18 to 24 years old, what is your top priority? And for the majority, it was climate change. But then there was also a part where it was rather unemployment and social issues, and this is happening in the eastern part and the southeastern part. So, of course, we have different needs, and I think in that respect, we need to connect the environmental question with the social question, and I think this was repeated here already enough, but this is also something that I've already observed as well in Brazil, that they are able to translate those very abstract scientific questions and things to the local needs, and because in Brazil it's the same, like they have very different priorities than climate action. But also talking about narrative, I think that we also should change that, like not always talking about, for example, 1.5 degree target. By the way, it should not be a target to reach 1.5 degree global warming. But, and also not talking so much about percentages and numbers and whatever, but making it more concrete and translating it to the local conditions. What will happen here if we continue like this? And at the same time also shifting from that no whatever and stop whatever to let's have a good life. Taking the contents from the SDGs and tell them let's have healthy food again. Let's have transportation that will make us healthy as well, and so on. So I think we should work on that as well. But one general remark would be to, we're always asking politicians to be more courageous, but also maybe we have to ask ourselves, can we be more courageous as well? Like also established NGOs, can you please be more courageous and like be more demanding? Because the topic is about sailing. Yes, we have to sail that boat, but a soft wind is not enough. We need a speed engine or a rocket. So please also help, using this momentum and be more courageous.
I guess we thought sailing was more sustainable than the speed engine, but we got the point. So seeing that there's already some kind of ambition to ask questions to you, Rebecca, I will just see if there's questions really for Rebecca, so we can make sure we can get some answers from you before you have to leave, and then we'll come back to the whole panel. So I think there was one question here, and if there's other questions for Rebecca, let me know.
Thank you. Dan Oleszynski from Slovakia, Center for Sustainable Alternatives. I will repeat my 2 points, which I mentioned on 20 September in one Slovak city when speaking to our students. First, if you are asking for changing the policy, for changing whatever, please start from yourself or from ourselves. So this is first question. Do you have some code of conduct of Friday's Future, Friday's students? What does it mean for us personally to starting this request? So starting from myself. And the second point, second risk, is the political misuse, which could happen quite easily. So if you do have some mechanisms to not be politically used by some political party in different country. Thank you.
Thank you. There was one more here in the front, the lady.
Hi, Rebecca. This is Angie. I'm from Colombia. I came all the way from there. And it's great that UN has a youth specialized department. I'm also youth. I'm 24. And I came here basically because I think that young people have a great opportunity to change all the environmental mind that we have. And I also have a question, and it's, I think youth have a great, let's say, we have a great technology, we have a great advantage, which is the technology. I mean, we handle communication, we have the most powerful thing, which is the social networks. And I think that as a young person, I'm not appreciating enough all the resources that we have through the social networks. Because, for example, in my country, in my city specifically, I'm from Barranquilla, we are measuring like all the indicators for the 2030 agenda. And I think that, for example, young people, since we have technology, we have access to all kind of devices. We can also provide like a very important data for example, the 2030 agenda. And I think that this is a source that, for example, my government is not seeing. And it will be amazing if, as young people, we can start measuring our, that says, for example, footprint in this case. Because in my country, we are also we have the carnival. I don't know if here in the room you know about the Barranquilla's carnival, but it's going to be the first time next year that we're going to measure the carbon footprint for the carnival, which is one of the biggest events in Colombia. And this is amazing because basically, I know that all ages people go to the carnival, but especially young people. So this is something that young people has like their specialty. And I think that in general, in the world, we have things that we can target specifically because these are things for young. And in general, we can have like an important, a really important, let's say, role in this kind of things, since we handle communication.
Thank you. Do we have one more for Rebecca? Yes, the gentleman in the front.
Hello again, my name is Nani Ammar and I am the president of the Green Movement in Algeria. So my question is to Ms. Rebecca. Ms. Rebecca, you said with the privilege of free speech and protest come a huge responsibility. And in the same paragraph you said, let us work to make the European Union greater again and make Europe a leader again. So what makes this kind of statement less different than what Trump said, let's make America great again? So my comment is, I know you are young and you didn't meant it this way, but I just want to make a statement that this kind of statements and individualism of some countries will make only the things worse. Because Europe, and to be honest, is not able to reach sustainability alone. So, and if other countries hear such statements, it will make them only suspicious and make the things worse. So I think a better statement will be, let's all work together to make our world greater again, or better again. Thank you very much.
Okay, we will let you answer the three questions.
Wow, that sounded very strange, but next time maybe please quote me correct, because I said when it comes to climate action, the thing is, what I've observed when I was working at the UN is that you have a lot of delegates approaching me and saying like, when is Germany or also when is the EU finally taking up the lead again, because you have the best preconditions for it. We have the technology, we have the science, we have the finance, so why aren't we actually taking that leading role again in sustainable development and climate action? And this is what I meant. And this is like where we should go to, and especially when it comes to trade agreements and so on. This is where the EU has to set the standards again, because we have that. I really think that we have that, it's kind of like of the domino effect. If we start doing something, I think that a lot of other countries will follow as well. All right. Next questions on Okay, next questions on social media. I think this is like, because we know how to handle social media, this is what helped us being so successful. So I definitely think we should also work on that more and also make use of technology in our generation. And then the other question on starting by yourself. The unique thing about Fridays for Future is that you have a lot of young people joining that movement who have never been politically before. And now for the first time, they go on the streets and you really see that they start asking themselves, like, okay, what is it that needs to be changed? And you see that they start changing as well. I mean, it's slow, but still. And also what I like very much is that they go to their parents and ask their parents, like, Mom, why are you still having that plastic bag? Why are you still taking the car? So education goes actually the other way around in these days. So you do see that, but because we have so many young people who have never been politically active before, you cannot expect that they're like 100% sustainability heroes. But also what I would like to mention in that respect is that, you know, when we always say we have to change ourselves, and I totally agree with that, we should not forget to also focus on the real structural changes that are needed so badly. When it comes to emissions, private households, at least I did the calculation for Germany, they only have an influence on 20% of the total emissions. So instead of only focusing the public debate on what can we only do, we should rather, you know, come together collectively and concentrate and point to the leaders and point to the, you know, big changes that we need to make.
Thank you. So let's go back to the panel with two more questions that I have for Nick and for Linn before we open again to your questions. Nick, I wanted to ask you, well, it sounds very optimistic what you said about what happened over the last few years, I understand, from really seeing a big change in certain industry sectors becoming much more interested and positive towards, you know, discussing and putting targets for themselves on climate neutrality. So I guess that's a great development. And I also see the added value in really working with the hard-to-get sectors, as we call them, because the potential is so big to achieve something if we get them on board. So that sounds all very optimistic. Now I have a question which is a bit more tricky. We've been working recently quite a bit with scientists and researchers who basically tell us that we need economic policies that move us to an economic system that helps us to decrease our dependence from economic growth. So we need to ask ourselves what kind of post-growth policies do we need? Now, you've been talking a lot about businesses understanding the business case for decarbonization, or let's say the sustainability case. Now, let's say implementing the SDGs, becoming more sustainable, becoming carbon neutral is not always a business case. And we have that kind of challenge that we cannot infinitely grow. Now, this is something that businesses usually don't want to talk about, because their whole idea is to grow their business, to sell more of their products, more sustainable products, but also more of their products. So how are you engaging in this new emerging debate about a post-growth society and economy?
Well, I would say it's clearly a massive challenge, and clearly the way in which the economy runs now is going to have to radically change within the next 2 and 3 decades, quite significantly. And I think that there's a mixture of different things here. Part of it is, how do you fuel economic activities? And there, the message is clear: there needs to be a radical shift away from fossil fuel dependency. And that's one of the key areas where economic growth has been detrimental to the environment, and that's where actually I don't think we're far from having completed the challenge. We talked about, you know, progress in the energy sector earlier on, but actually I would say the bulk of the progress we've made has been more on power, because on heating we are miles behind where we need to be in terms of moving away from gas as a main source of heating. I think the way in which we power the transport sector, both road transport which is the easy area to change, and then trickier sectors like shipping and aviation. We have a long road to go down to actually substitute the fuels that make those sectors work, as well as changing demand patterns. And then you've got heavy industry, again, hugely dependent on coal and other sources of fossil fuel at the moment to operate. So I think if you could already have a policy package to really help drive a move away from those sources, you would already hugely reduce the sort of environmental negative impact from economic activities. But I think in terms of growth, it also depends how you measure growth. If you use GDP, which is well known not to be a particularly interesting measure through which to measure growth, and you start looking more at job creation, and you start looking more at different business models whereby a retailer, for example, is no longer about selling as many goods as you can, but it's more about building long-term relationships with your clients whereby you lease them a good, they come back to you at the end of the good's life and lease another one. So we're seeing a lot of DIY stores, for example, like Castorama and others wanting to sort of move from a simple buy and sell business model to more of a leasing relationship with clients whereby you will sell less stuff, you will make possibly less money in a short run, but your clients might still be with you on 10, 15, 20 years' time because they have that regular contact point with you, whereby they come back, you can repair the good for them, or you can recondition a good for them, and they can reuse it again, or it can be sold to somebody else. So I think the economic model is going to change, but there are going to be other ways for businesses to thrive and contribute to the community, but it will be different to what we've seen up until now.
Thanks a lot. And that brings me back to my last question so far for Linn, and on environmental and social standards that we have achieved in the EU. And now in the light of Brexit, what are the implications? I mean, initially Brexit was promised not to weaken our environmental and social standards, but now it seems that these pledges are kind of slipping away, and we're going more again in the direction of a deregulatory approach here. So what do we have to do to protect our environmental and social standards facing the risk of a neighbor who might undermine them?
Well, that's a tricky question. Actually, yeah, what we see in Great Britain, of course, nothing's certain yet because until now the UK is still a member of the European Union, but the signs get stronger that the business model, at least the Tory government, would like to thrive in a post-Brexit Europe, is on a deregulatory one. So advancement to the US via a free trade agreement, whether or not this is economically favorable to a free trade agreement with the European Union, put aside. But to see that social and environmental standards might be up for grabs in order to thrive economically, which would be damning, which from the European perspective is of course something that shouldn't undermine our policy role. And this is of course something where you all come into play, where all the social forces come into play, saying that our European values are not only on individual rights and freedoms, but also our collective rights, and that, of course, social justice and ecological rights play a part of that. But it will be hard, and we already see that with the new European Commission has been also introduced a one-in, one-out principle that for every new legislation, one other legislation has to be scrapped, which is, of course, something that from a public goods perspective, and this is not only from environmental affairs, but also for me in my day job as working for the consumer movement, is also something that is deeply troubling. And I think here, the most important thing is to keep up the pressure and to say that our European business model, our European home, can only work if we have these high standards. And I don't see them up for grabs immediately, but it's always it can be a slippery slope depending on how the UK is playing this card post-Brexit. also because we already see in countries like Hungary and Poland that the consensus on we need a climate transition is not really there yet. So we already have member states who aren't fully convinced that it is important to have such a Green New Deal, such a climate transition.
Thank you. So let's open the debate again with you. I think we have a survey here about questions, most popular questions. So let's have a look what you're interested in. So the most popular question from Alice is, what are the main danger areas where industry could lobby to undermine the Green Deal? Maybe Alice, can you say a bit more about where your question comes from and explain a bit what you want to know, and maybe which panelists you want to answer your question?
Hi, yeah, so I'm Alice from the Changing Markets Foundation, and I think Rebecca, before she left, mentioned that the oil and gas companies have spent 250 million lobbying the EU, and I don't think it's only those industries. And so I just wondered what you thought were the main areas that we should be looking out for industry lobbying to undermine the Green Deal. And to all the panelists, really, if you have a view on that. Thank you.
Okay, then let's have a look also at the second most popular question, and then maybe the panelists can already answer both of them. So there's another one on nature-based solutions. Which role could nature-based solutions, like forest, peatlands, and other ecosystems play in the Green New Deal, and how can we push for them? So there's a question around nature-based solutions. Maybe Jan, you can also say a bit more about your question. Interestingly, most probably the next UN Environment Assembly will also focus on nature-based solutions, so there might be a whole new discussion starting about them. But explain your question.
Good morning, Jan Peters from the Greifswald-Meyer Center. We see in all the discussions a lot about economy, about energy sector, transport sector, and so on and so forth. But many of us are also working or coming from the nature conservation side, and we see that many nature-based solutions are still not really recognized in all member states and also on the EU level. Especially I'm working with peatlands, which have only a very small share of land area, but huge disproportional emissions in many member states, making up like around 5% of total emissions in the EU. And my question is how these nature-based solutions, which are now like tackled under the nature conservation legislation, but also play a big role in the CAP discussion, of course, how these can also feed into the Green Deal discussion and how we can bring them in.
Thanks a lot for the question. Is there a direct follow-up question to that one? Okay, then.
My name is Bernd Michael Wilke. I'm a soil scientist, and I'd like to support your question because soils are so important for the storage of carbon. They store twice more carbon than what we have in the atmosphere. And my colleague got the Environmental Prize of Germany for her research on the storage of carbon and this importance. And we should focus on this point, I think.
Thanks a lot. So let's give our panelists a chance to answer on both the questions on industry lobby being a danger to the Green New Deal and on the role of nature-based solutions. Maybe we can just do one round. Dirk, if you want to start.
So I wanted to support you regarding the ecosystem-based solutions, because we need to understand that even if we would decarbonize completely our energy systems during the next decades towards 2050 or towards 2040, destroying the land use resources which are absorbing carbon, we would not get climate issues right. This is very important. We are currently working on a next report of the German Advisory Council on Global Change, and we talk about a second frontier, which is not in the center of the debate, but it should be. So we have two issues to solve if you would like to move in the corridor of 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. One is decarbonizing energy systems, etc., etc. We know about that. But the second frontier is then ecosystem-based solutions, because 50% of the emissions which we have are being observed by land use systems and the oceans. And what we are doing is we are destroying the land use systems and destabilizing their absorptive capacities. Therefore, this point of issue is very important. And it is not easy to solve because we have different things which you have to bring together. Soil systems and land use systems is about food security for 10 billion people in 2050. It is about sinks for carbon. It is about biodiversity and stabilizing ecosystems, and it is also about bioenergy and its role in the global energy system. No? So if we don't get this complex issue right, we will fail, and we do not have a sufficient debate about that. This is, I think, the point which I wanted to make regarding the ecosystem-based solutions. Absolutely priority, and we have to focus on that. We do not have the debate which we needed to have.
Following or connecting to your question, I think I can't really talk about the Green New Deal, but I would like to raise awareness to the EU budget debate in that respect, because you already said it yourself that the Common Agriculture Policy plays a role in there. And I think this is where the negotiations are super crucial, because we're talking about the EU budget and farm subsidies and so on for the next 7 years, starting 2021. And this is where this discussion has to take place as well, that we move or that we change the system from direct payments to farmers more to this conservation point of view. So I think it is important in the Green New Deal, but maybe again on implementation, it might be even more important to look at the multi-annual financial framework. I can't really talk a lot about industry lobbying, but just maybe rephrase or I'd like to think about it from a different perspective. Maybe it is also important to think about those industries that support your position and to build a pro-environmental coalition with those industries that are already on this path of change. I think it's always important to know who your enemies are, but in this debate it might be even, I don't know if more important, but it's certainly also important to have your allies right.
Well, so I'll go for both as well. I think on the industry one, I mean, I can imagine that there's a lot of lobbying underway right now with the Commission about to come in to try and water down some of their plans. And I remember a few months ago, famously seeing that leaked draft press release from Business Europe before the EU long-term strategy came out on net zero, which was quite funny because it basically just said to its members, just oppose everything in all your press releases, and it wasn't particularly evidence-based. So I would imagine that you have a lot of trade associations in Europe, and especially in Brussels, that operate at a very lowest common denominator basis. So the least ambitious member sets the tone. So pretty much the exact opposite of how we set up Aldersgate Group. And they're very powerful. So I would imagine that there'll be a lot of opposition from some quarters to the overall ambition of the Green New Deal, to any specific legally binding targets. We saw that, I mean, when the 2030 package was being debated, there was a lot of successful lobbying to water down binding renewable energy targets. I imagine that there's going to be a lot of opposition to a rising carbon price, especially if the carbon price is to significantly rise to the level it has to be if we're credibly on track for net zero. But I do think there's a way to counter that. I think the way to counter it in terms of the contents of the Green New Deal is to have a very clear overall ambition, but to then have that ambition backed up by 3 key pillars. The first one, I think, has to be around innovation. So some of the nervosity from some of the industrial sectors less keen on all this transition is the fact that the technologies or business models needed to get to net zero are at the moment quite a bit more expensive than the status quo. So I think there's a big role for policy there to trial key technologies and new business models at scale. So just to give you an example, one thing that we lobbied the UK government for and we got was a pilot project on industrial decarbonisation, and to get them to create a first ultra-low carbon cluster of industries by 2030. And they're going to try CCS, they're going to try hydrogen, they're going to try increased use of renewable electricity to power industrial processes. So I think a really ambitious package on innovation, both in terms of financial and technical support, will be important. Secondly is I think you need very clear market creation policies. That includes a rising carbon price, but it could also include other things that the EU is very good at, which are product standards. We've established a really good track record for the eco-design regulations in terms of improving the energy efficiency of energy appliances. If we could start using product standards to drive down the embedded carbon for industrial products, I think that would really help reassure industry that there is there will be a clear growing market demand for low-carbon steel, for low-carbon cement, low-carbon chemicals, and so on. And that's an idea that's also gaining traction in many quarters of UK industry, but I think would clearly be done better at the European level. And then you need a global dimension. Which goes back to the issue of trade. And I think diplomacy is to really making sure that in any trade deal that the EU enters into, abidance by high environmental standards is a real critical plank of that trade policy. So I think, by next year we'll see big challenges on the lobbying front, but I do think there's a way of addressing those, especially at the very least, a way of making it harder for parts of industry to oppose it. On nature-based solutions, I completely agree. I think peatland restoration, soil restoration tend to be issues that are often ignored, even though in the case of soils, the extent to which soils are degraded across Europe is just hugely concerning. And we tend to forget that both are not only good carbon sinks, but they're also healthy peatlands and healthy soils are essential to adapt to climate change. So they are, whichever way you look at it, whether it's biodiversity, it's climate adaptation, or emission reductions, we need them. Something that got pretty unnoticed in the UK before the general election was called, but which was quite important, is that the government had been put under sufficient pressure to introduce an environment bill in Parliament. And the overall objective of the bill was to reverse the decline of the natural environment within a generation. And there was a commitment in that bill to introduce legally binding targets on things such as soil, health, peatlands, air quality, water quality, resource efficiency. And the whole idea was that those legally binding targets would be reviewed every 5 years and would be backed up by regulations to drive improvement in the natural environment, but also financial incentives and other things to really get businesses to invest in environmental restoration. And the overall idea was to basically create an equivalent to the UK Climate Change Act, but for the natural environment. So I think the European Green Deal will need to have an element of that throughout, because it's important in the context of negative emissions, and it's important in the context of climate adaptation. If I could just go back very briefly to the Brexit questions, because I can't resist, but I'll be brief. I think there is indeed a risk of having ultra low tax, environmentally deregulated UK sitting on the edge of Europe, but I think there's some pretty big barriers to that actually happening in practice. The first one is that there is actually a remarkable degree of alignment between businesses and environmental NGOs in the UK at the moment on all things environmental and climate. And one thing that really worries both businesses and environmental NGOs is a trade deal with the United States. It really worries most of the business groups, including all of the farming and agricultural community, because ultimately standards in place in the UK are significantly higher than those in place in the United States, and imports of American products on American terms would drive many British businesses on the edge of bankruptcy. So I think you could expect a significant pushback from businesses, farming, trade unions, and environmental NGOs if the government was really trying to force through a low environmental standards agenda. But it is clear that some people would like to do that, but I think there will be quite a big social, environmental, NGO, and business pushback on that. The second point, also just to highlight, is the election that's currently in play has got a seriously uncertain outcome. The Conservative Party are still favourite, and they may well win a proper majority, in which case Brexit will go ahead, and will go ahead soon. But there are equally a number of other scenarios whereby some kind of coalition government comes in power. And under those scenarios, it is much more likely that you would end up with a second referendum situation. And bearing in mind that this would happen in a context where the level of public concern on climate change and environmental issues has really grown up quite significantly. So you could actually end up in 2 years' time, against all odds, with a UK still part of the EU and actually abiding by quite high environmental standards and actually making the case for high environmental standards. It's not the most likely outcome at the moment, but it's not something I would discount just yet.
Okay. Let's see if we have another most popular question. Well, yeah, let's take that one from Arthur. The Green Deal will make European products more expensive. How imports of cheap products can be limited, and how can we secure jobs in Europe? Maybe, Arthur, you want to say a little bit more about the background of your question?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Arthur Kamchuk from GAC Bukovina, from Romania. So I want to emphasize on the financial aspects of the project. Of course, I'm sustaining the project, but as an engineer, we must be very realistic. I am working by 10 years in wind energy, and I can tell you the price for the extension of the grid is not so low. So basically, all of this project will make some prices of the European products to increase, and some commercial trade deals are to be changed or renegotiated. Exactly what was said before regarding the deal with the United States. So the equation is more complex than it seems. So are there any studies about this, or are there any studies scheduled to solve this?
Thank you. So questions keep coming back on trade policies, and it's also one thing I wanted to ask you again, Dirk, because you mentioned in your initial statement, very briefly, you said, well, we in the EU, we lack kind of a vision of the kind of global trade policies that we want, or the kind of global trade that we imagine, and others are doing that. So maybe you can also come back to that statement and explain a bit what is the kind of trade agenda that you would like to envisage for the EU, and link it to Arthur's question.
Yeah, I would start with a broader perception and then go into the trade issue in a second step. No, I mean, what I meant at the beginning is that what we are observing is that we have a completely fragmented global order in front of us, and what we need is global cooperation for sustainability solutions, because most of the issues are globally interconnected. So we cannot solve the climate problem without global cooperation. We cannot stabilize the ecosystem without global cooperation. And therefore, from a European perspective, we need to invest much more capital, technology, agreements around the globe to make multilateralism in this difficult contract work. No? And I mentioned the Silk Road perspective of China. China has an idea, I don't like it, no? But they do have an idea how a global economic order might look like. Europe has no idea how we could influence towards a different kind of global order which would be compatible with sustainable development. This is about trade, but it's also about the International Monetary Fund, it's about regional banks, it's about our cooperation with different regions around the globe, it is about investments in different sectors, etc., etc., etc. Where is our project for a global order and a global economy? Considering that, this was an argument which has been put forward by the colleague from Colombia. No? We are only 5%, so we should not produce hybrid. We should not produce a situation in which we don't understand that we can only cooperate with others to change global structures. But we need a vision for that, and we don't have it still. And I would hope that the next Commission invests in this. No? And linking this global order idea with multilateralism on the one hand side and sustainability on the other hand side, this could be a brand of the European Union. No? And the trade issue is part of that. So if we go for significant carbon prices, something like a carbon tax adjustment mechanism would make a lot of sense. No? And if we go for trade agreements with regions, bringing green and environmental and social standards in, do work, because during the last negotiation rounds, the European Union already started, fortunately, to consider much more social and environmental dynamics within trade than beforehand. So the big movements and the big discussions which we had about the future of trade 2-3 years ago had an impact. This is good, no? But the overall framework is still missing. The overall framework of our idea how a global future order might look like, this is something we need to work on. Others are doing this destructively, the United States, for example, and the next emerging power, China, has a clear idea where to move the planet towards, and we are still working in a very fragmented way. I've been working a lot about development policy. No? So we have 28 different development policies for Africa. Why won't we have one? I mean, this would be much more powerful. We are investing 60% of global official development aid, of the global official development aid budget, but we are doing this in such a fragmented way. You know? So there are many levers to push things forward. In this sense, Europe should aiming at becoming a global power, no? From this sustainability and multilateral perspective.
Thank you. Linn and Nick, do you also want to comment on like the broader question of, let's say, Europe's responsibility in the world, or specifically the question of trade? And we've discussed the question of carbon adjustments, border tariffs this morning, also with the German Environment Ministry, who was a bit more reluctant or questioning. So maybe we can also hear from you. I mean, how do you discuss these ideas within your networks?
Well, I think that's actually this whole issue of product standard competitiveness is where our engagement with a lot of hard-to-treat sectors, including many businesses who aren't our members, was the most interesting. Because if I was to summarize the change of perspective from businesses in hard-to-treat sectors like cement, steel, and others, it would be that we're up for this, we're up for delivering net zero, but we don't want to get undermined in the process. And what they're really saying is, if we start putting a lot of our money into, for example, getting a big steel making company to run on hydrogen, we then want to see American or Chinese steel with a much higher carbon content arriving on the market, because then we would totally go out of business. So that's where I think, carbon pricing and carbon border adjustment could play a role, but I think that's where product standards are so interesting. Because if you set product standards with a declining level of embedded carbon that would reduce over time, you would set a clear net zero direction for industrial goods, but you would also protect European businesses from imports that don't meet similar standards, because there would be a market standards, it would be a clear level playing field applying across the single market, applicable to any product arriving on the single market. Now, there would still be competition, but the competition would be within the prism of being able to deliver industrial products that are ultra low carbon. So I think this issue of product standards is something that we really need to look at quite carefully, because I think it can help both drive innovation, it can help grow the market for the kind of low carbon products that we want and need, but it can also help protect the competitiveness of European industry. And I think the advantage it has over a carbon tax at the border is that it's less political. Albeit it does regulate the kind of trade that you can have in the same way that a carbon adjustment tax would, but it's less setting a standard is less political than putting a tax on something. So I think it's definitely something that should be in the toolbox. But someone sort of threw me an interesting challenge the other day at a CCS conference, and it was sort of the same observation as you, saying, low carbon goods are more expensive than the high carbon kind. So how do you stay competitive? But her question was about exports. So how do you make sure that European exports stay competitive if we are, for example, selling industrial goods to countries like India or China, or the US, where carbon standards are nowhere near as tight as in Europe? And I think it goes back to the whole innovation policy agenda. We really have to invest quite significantly in Europe in the next 5 years to really not only deploy new technologies at scale, but really bring down their costs to make sure that actually developing ultra-low carbon goods becomes cheaper and cheaper in the near future, and means that exporters of those products can sell them in foreign markets, and that's a really big challenge that we need to take on, because there is quite a big gap at the moment.
Thanks, Nick. Linn.
Yeah, as a network consisting of both business, environmental organizations, trade, labor unions, and so on, we don't have as specific political recommendations, although our network is in favor of CO2 pricing, which I think in itself, given the fact that we are quite diverse, is quite something. And I think what of course comes with it is the question of how to cater for products being imported into the EU market. As I said, whether it's a carbon adjustment border tax or the question of standards, we don't have a position on that. But maybe to go a bit more into the question of how to cater for the social consequences, which was also part of the question, because what we see here is what will be in the Green New Deal is this just transition fund in order to cater for these divergences. And I think on the European level, what we also need to discuss or follow more closely is the question of social harmonization. So this has also been something that the Commission will have on their desks, the question of minimum wages in Europe. So we have minimum wages, for example, in Germany, but in many EU member states we don't. So I think having to raise some prices due to a greening of the economy has to go hand in hand with such social harmonization measures with the climate transition fund. So this is important from our perspective.
Thanks a lot, Linn. So, well, we are running a bit out of time, but I see one urgent question there. So I will take this one question, but then please bear with us that we will have to slowly close the session. So,
yes. Thank you very much. Actually, my question is on the top of the questions over there, but I forgot to sign myself. I think we should also pay attention to the Eastern Europe. It's a very important part of EU policy, and I am from Czech Republic. My name is Jana Dlouhá, and in our country we have a prime minister who is owner of the biggest agriculture company, which is really not environmental friendly. He is planting some biofuels, destroying our soil, and so on. And there are big civic movements against our prime minister, who is, by the way, more rigid than Trump. Because he has interests which are not compatible with his function, and with no result, because we feel that maybe there is some support from some totalitarian regimes from eastern part of the world. So I don't know what to do with that issue, yes, because part of our civic society is definitely against this policy, is supporting climate change and so on, but we are powerless. Yes.
Thank you. So. Who wants to comment on also, it's also about the role of civil society in such scenario, and well, who's in charge and who's in power, and what can we do to change that? Maybe a short statement.
Well, I wouldn't say you're powerless, because what we see in the past weeks is that, well, you probably know better than I, but that hundreds of thousands of Czechs are going to the streets, and as many as haven't been since before the fall of the wall. So I think you aren't powerless, but of course it's a problem if there is a prime minister with very strong connections to business, and that's also why there has been this I lost my words, the procedure of the European Union against him because his vested interests and so on. But So I just want to react to that I don't think you're powerless, even if it might seem that way in a moment, but it should be more about using these protests now and bringing them, as organized society, bringing them further and channelizing it to the next elections, and maybe then in a democratic way using it.
I would like to give a more generic answer because, I mean, we do have these kind of discussions not only in Eastern Europe. No? We also have very different discussions in the German context between wealthy Western parts of our country and then other parts in the Eastern context who already moved towards a very difficult transition, and now we are asking for a next deep transformation. No? Or when I'm moving around and working in fossil-driven developing economies, similar questions are rising. So we might ask the question, how can we motivate people and civil society to work for deep transformation and accelerating change? Because this is not an easy issue, which we are asking people for. And if you look into science, again and again, you get 4 elements together which are needed to try to convince people to move into the sustainability direction which we are discussing. And the first one is, and I think we have been making a lot of progress here in Europe and worldwide, as Nick, you mentioned regarding the economy, as Rebecca told us about youth movements, etc., understanding the problem. So why do we need to change so drastically? And we have to convince people that there is a huge problem to solve, and many people have been understanding this. We made a lot of progress in this regard, but this is not enough. The second step is then that people are uncertain. So if you ask for cutting emissions to 0 by 2040 in a region where employment is linked to the car industry or to coal power plants, what do you expect? I mean, a lot of uncertainty is what you have in front of you. So therefore, demonstrating and showing that the transformation, that the transition can work is very important. In the German context, for example, it's still difficult for political actors to understand that regarding the mobility system and urban areas, we can move forward much more rapidly than we do. And we have fantastic examples in the Netherlands, in Denmark, in Sweden. We are lacking far behind in Germany. So demonstrating to mayors and citizens that Utrecht is a fantastic city with 40% less mobility and 40% less cars, this is a strong argument. No? Demonstrating that in Copenhagen, 70% of people are going to work by bicycle, in Berlin less than 5. So we can learn from best, we can demonstrate that it works. This is the second element. The third element is that we need fair and just solutions within our countries and globally. If we don't convince, let's say, the 20% or the 40% in the national context and the 50% in the global context of people at the lower part of the income pyramid, that we will find just such solutions for them, we will not convince people to move forwards towards sustainability. Rebecca mentioned the Brazil case, no? And I could tell you about many countries around the world. So the fairness issue is the third element. And the fourth element is we need to talk much more and we need to be much more convincing regarding attractive futures. We are talking a lot about the reduction of emissions and circular economy, etc., but this sounds so technical for many people. No? So no one will fall in love with a climate price system, you know. But we might fall in love with attractive cities where we bring less cars and better health and better and livable cities together. So attractive futures, which needs to be developed in very different contexts around the globe. You know? So if you bring these 4 elements together, these can help to create legitimacy for change, because we need to understand that we are in a situation in which many people fear change and transformations. The right-wing movements we are fighting against, they are part of this narrative. No? So their point is that everything is running out of order. No one is controlling all these kind of dynamics. And what are we answering them? We need fast transformation, acceleration, and we need all of that because the climate issues are so urgent. But if we don't link this to these mechanisms to create motivation for change, it will not work.
Thanks, Dirk. maybe
Thank you. I'll keep it short. Having tried to ride a bicycle around Alexanderplatz yesterday, I understand why only 5% of people take their bike to work, but I agree it needs to change. I think your question is really interesting, because I really had it in mind when I was making my points around innovation and just transition earlier on. It's clear that when I engage with, say, Western European businesses, I tend to get much more ambitious answers on climate and environment than when I deal with Eastern European businesses. But having said that, I think we do need to also appreciate at the core of this that although the transition to moving to net zero emissions is challenging, it's clearly easier if you're implanted in an energy system that's lower carbon at the beginning and where there is more modern infrastructure. And in some Eastern European countries, ultimately businesses are implanted in a system which is primarily driven by some of the most polluting forms of fossil fuels. And therefore, their ability to move to a lower carbon model economy is that much more challenging, both in infrastructure terms, in business model terms, but also in cost terms. And I think going back to the Green New Deal, I think the EU is going to have to make some really important and tough decisions in terms of innovation funding, in terms of infrastructure rollout funding, in terms of skills and educational policies, and ensure that Eastern European member states receive a lot of that support. I don't think it should just be Eastern European member states, because, as Dirk pointed out, actually, if you look at the geography of and social demographics at the moment in Western countries, there are huge inequalities in Western member states as well, between areas that are doing well and areas that feel completely left behind. And that's essentially how the Brexit referendum happened in the UK. But clearly, I think Eastern Europe has a much bigger infrastructure and business model, economic model challenge ahead of it, and really deserves a lot of support and should be a key priority area in the Green New Deal.
Thanks a lot, Nick. So I guess we're coming to the end of that session. We had a bit of a democratic approach here with those questions being taken that were the most popular. I hope you agreed with this approach. You might still have some appetite for more questions, but maybe you're also wondering about lunch outside there, and we won't let you wait for too long. So thanks a lot to all our panelists for joining us, for spending your time with us, for answering all the questions. We hope Rebecca is on her way to Bremen to convince the policymakers there for some more ambitious climate change. And I believe that for our discussions in the afternoon around the next 5 years in the EU and the European Green Deal, we got a lot of food for thought of things that we really need to integrate more into our demands for the European Green Deal. I'm really taking back that a European Green Deal is not going to work if the EU is a bit lost on the international level and if we don't really shape more our answer to our global responsibility. And you also mentioned the missing link to the 2030 agenda and a more long-term approach to sustainable development in which we need to embed the European Green Deal. I think we also take back that digitalization is an issue that we also need to deal with, and probably come up also with more concrete demands from the side of the environmental movement. And well, we had a lot of discussion around differing realities in different parts of the EU, and I think also the European Green Deal needs to take stock of these different realities. The question of inequalities, fair transition, I think we also as an environmental organization need to make strong points to include that and make sure that the social movement doesn't feel alienated from the discussion around the Green Deal, which is something which is already a bit happening, that there's a bit of the environmental organizations are very excited and the social organizations are a bit more like, okay, we feel like our priorities are a bit lower now in the agenda, so I think we have to be, we have to develop our strong unified voice around these issues. I was also happy to hear a very strong, like they say, pro-regulatory approach from your organization. You mentioned product policy a couple of times as one of the areas where there's still a lot of potential to work to work at the European level, but also trade policies have been mentioned, I think, and we started with that contradiction between like the trade agenda in the political priorities and the Green Deal. So I think that's another take-home point for us to really elaborate more on our trade-related demands. So I think we have a lot of food for thought and a lot of homework to do. So thank you again for joining us on the panel. And we just have a couple of practical announcements before we will let you go off for your well-deserved lunch. So thank you very much for coming.